Hello, this is Dr. Hyatt Frobose speaking here today to welcome you all to the 2021 Gestal Swine Summit, where we'll be working together over 4 weeks to share knowledge between researchers, producers, veterinarians, and nutritionists. I'd like to start by introducing us to the topic for today, which is going to be on the gray areas of California Prop 12, a conference between myself from Giga Technologies and Rachel Burke from a certifying company named EarthClaims, where we're going to take a deeper dive into some of the nuances in regard to the pork industry impacts of California Prop 12 taking effect at the end of this year. But before doing so, I'd like to thank our major sponsor, Hypor Genetics, for helping us put on this event here today. Always a great partner to work with here in the industry. I'd like to start by giving all of our audience a little background on Prop 12. In the United States, it's been a topic of much debate here in the pork industry, but I know we have a lot of audience members from around the world who may or may not have the same background. And so I'd like to start with that perspective. First of all, the Proposition 12 is formally named the Prevention of Cruelty to Farm Animals Act, and it applies to breeding pigs as well as laying hens and veal calves. And this act was passed by voter referendum in 2018, but it actually doesn't take effect until January 1st of next year for pork meat. Why this law for California is so important to the rest of the country is that it applies not only to pork raised in California, but any pork sold in California, regardless of where it originates. The pork industry has tried via various legal efforts to overturn this legislation, but those attempts thus far have been ineffective. And it looks as of right now that we're geared for having to be compliant by the start of next year for the pork industry. The California Department of Food and Agriculture, also known as CDFA, did recently release proposed implementation regulations in late May of this year, but this still doesn't leave a lot of time for clear guidelines for the pork industry to adapt when we have such a large percentage of the population in California to feed. To give a little bit more details about what this means for pork producers, this rule applies to any female pig kept for breeding that is 6 months of age or older or pregnant. Each of these female pigs must have at least 24 square feet of usable floor space, and that eliminates the ability to use traditional gestation stalls, as you can see in the picture from the use of pork producers. And it's important to note that this rule applies to whole pork meat only, not to ground product or combination food products, such as those that are included in soups, sandwiches, pizzas, hot dogs, etc. So things like pork loins and bacon and pulled pork, your normal pork products, many of those are still going to be having to be in compliance for Proposition 12. There are some important exemptions with relation to this, and worth noting are some of the ones that are highlighted, including sows that are undergoing individual treatment, sows that are within 5 days of their expected farrowing date, those that are currently nursing piglets in lactation, and animals that are undergoing temporary animal husbandry purposes, such as breeding or pregnancy examination, although those temporary animal husbandry things can only take place for a maximum of 6 hours in a given day and not greater than 24 hours in a 30-day period. So how is this impacting those of us outside of California? Again, we have a large population of over 40 million people in California, which represents over 12% of the US population. And California has a higher percentage of demographics such as Asian Americans and Hispanics who have historically been high consumers of pork. So the actual per capita consumption of California for pork is about 15% of the US. Despite this fact, only about 9,000 sows, according to the USDA in 2020, are actually raised and grown in the state of California, which represents only 0.1% of the US sow herd. So inevitably, a lot of other state pork producers are going to have to pick up the slack to provide the pork for California, which is where Proposition 12 will have the greatest impact. In early 2021, economists estimated that there were less than 4% of US sow farms that were currently compliant for these new regulations for California. And although we've seen some movement by some producers heading that direction, it still remains unlikely that we'll have enough pork that is compliant according to the standards by the onset of next year when it's scheduled to take effect. This, in effect, will likely cause a shortfall, albeit possibly temporary, in California compliant pork. And this certainly has some people up in arms about how this is going to be rolled out. So with that background on what is California Prop 12, I look forward to going into details with the certifier that I have present here with me to interact with today. I'd like to introduce everyone to Rachel Burke from EarthClaims. Rachel, good to have you here. And could you please give us a little bit more background on both yourself and EarthClaims and what your company's role has been?
Of course. Well, thank you so much for having me on today, Hyatt. I'm delighted to speak with you about this legislation from my perspective as a certifier for programs similar to this. So I'm Rachel Burke. I'm a Director of Certification for EarthClaims, and I'm based in Oregon. My background is I have a degree in animal sciences from Oregon State University with a focus on research and production. I have been the Director of Certification Services now for going on about 6 years. And our company is an independent animal agriculture certification company. So we're primarily serving the needs of producers who are looking to achieve animal welfare certification for the purposes of increasing their market access to retailers and outlets such as Whole Foods Market and other similar outlets. So we annually certify about 3,500 farms and ranches throughout the United States and Canada. We have over 20 inspectors and staff sprinkled throughout North America. And the programs that we certify for and manage are generally considered some of the most complex and most robust and highly regarded programs in the industry. And that includes Global Animal Partnership Animal Welfare Certification, which is a animal welfare certification program for all species from, or all meat species, I should say, as well as eggs and dairy, everything from beef production through meat, chicken, and turkey, and to pork, of course. And we also manage the organic grass-fed dairy program in partnership with our partner, the Organic Plus Trust. And in addition to that, we do quite a bit of retail taste traceability certification, custom certification programs, and non-GMO and antibiotic-free type certifications. So it's with this background that I hope to be able to bring some insight to you all on this new legislation that's coming out of California. And I certainly want to be clear that we did not create this rule and we're not advocating for it. Our goal is simply to support livestock producers in navigating what is looking to become reality here pretty soon in California and to help them access the market given this new regulatory scheme. I feel like it's important to state up front that this rule is still in draft. Public comment recently closed, and we don't know how much or how little change is going to be made to the rule as it's currently written in the coming weeks and months. So we're reading the tea leaves here as a certifier, trying to understand and learn more about the program's requirements as it's still unfolding. And understand that the bureaucratic challenges, they're challenging for us as a certifier, knowing how to advise you all. And I'm sure it feels the same to producers and companies looking to comply. We do have some clarity based on what has been published so far, but we'll be looking to the CDFA to give us some more guidance on the nuances of some of these standards. And that's looking like it'll take some time yet. But I think that we can have a productive discussion here based on my experience with similar certification, and we can probably conjecture with a fair degree of certainty about how this rule is going to play out on the production side.
Thank you for being here, Rachel, and I appreciate the ensuing discussion. Could you also give a little bit of perspective about what it is currently labeled as needed to become accredited as a certifier for Proposition 12 by the state of California, and what that process entails for a company like EarthClaims?
Yeah, that's a great question. So currently, to my knowledge, no certifiers are accredited yet by CDFA for Prop 12 certification. However, they've laid out some guidelines in the rule about what it would require to become accredited as a certifier. So they're looking for companies that have a background in animal welfare certification or similar certification that are able to evaluate with a good degree of certainty and with a robust internal procedure that farms and producers are able to comply with this standard. And I know the state of California, in addition, will probably have its own inspectors as well. So they will not be they will not be relying solely on third-party certifiers. But given the fact that this rule is going to impact producers all throughout North America and possibly beyond, I'm anticipating that they will engage the services of other third-party certifiers at some point. We don't know when they're going to begin that accreditation process, but I'm hoping that we will be able to become accredited here shortly.
Great. Yes, thank you. And just for our audience, the type of certification typically involves a once a year on-site visit to a site that would be certified or would be evaluated for certification.
Yeah, that's right. So there's two main elements to this legislation, right? So there's two basic requirements, at least it seems basic on its surface, right? So there's the minimum square footage requirement for sow units. And then there's also an audit trail requirement as well. So what that means when it all plays out is that producers will need to have an on-site annual inspection of their facilities in order for CDFA to determine that they have become compliant or are in the process of becoming compliant with this requirement. And then it looks like there's also going to be a requirement for every single operation down the chain that sources from that sow unit to be certified as having their product come from a compliant unit. So that's everything from the distributor of that product all the way through to the end retailer will need to be able to provide documentation indicating that their pork product came from a California Prop 12 certified operation. So in answer to your question, the short answer is yes, there's going to be an on-site requirement and then also probably a document inspection requirement.
Perfect. Thank you. That's excellent background. So you alluded to it, one standard relating to 24 square feet being something that seems somewhat simple on its surface. And I think it initially approaches that way too. I've had the opportunity to work with a lot of different farms who are evaluating what it might take to become compliant if they were to adapt their production or to build additional facilities that would be Prop 12 compliant. And so that's where I've brought into the crux of a lot of these conversations. And with my effort in building design, trying to provide producers with guidance that would not only be compliant for these standards and provide animals the recommended amounts of square footage, et cetera, but also do so in a somewhat cost-effective manner. Of course, this application of this rule is also coinciding with a major spike in materials and construction costs. And so it's certainly getting additional scrutiny because the timing is not exactly great. But I'd like to focus on a few areas with you today, Rachel, that are areas that I often come across as places where we ask a lot of questions or places where there might be some room for interpretation from a certifier to give some perspective on what your auditors and what your certification role how you will view some of these pieces of the equation. The first topic that I'd like to focus on is that temporary restraint. I alluded earlier that sows can be excluded from the rules of Prop 12 for temporary animal husbandry purposes. And those commonly include steps like artificial insemination, pregnancy examination, veterinary intervention. But the rules for Proposition 12 specify a maximum of 6 hours per day or a maximum of 24 hours within a 30-day period. What I found the industry, or those producers who are taking serious steps to become compliant for Proposition 12, they're choosing to use free access stalls, as you can see in the picture here, or something very similar as temporary restraining areas where these animals can be gathered into and either run a bore in front of them or actually artificially inseminate or those type of procedures. A portion of the farm having some of these has proven to be a popular option, and they will typically provide enough space behind the stalls, as you can see in this picture where the sows are laying, for the sows to still have access to a total of 24 square foot. I'd like your perspective on how free access stalls are viewed and interpreted, and what it would take for a customer to be able to provide the right information for an auditor when it comes to this area of the farm where temporary restraint is popular, is commonly happening?
Yeah, absolutely. So free access stalls and similar type setups are not restricted by the standard as it's currently written. And I think that you're absolutely right that a lot of folks are going to continue to retain those to some degree or to a great degree on their operations. And it's interesting because a previous version of this rule restricted producers from using any kind of a confinement that did not allow the sow to fully turn around or lie recumbent without touching the sides of the wall. And they've since seemingly taken that out. So it appears that free access stalls are still able to be on the site. They're not restricting them from being on the operation. But as far as usage, I think that's going to be, that's an area that's going to be heavily scrutinized by auditors because of this maximum 6 hours per day or 24 hours in a 30-day period. Auditors are going to be, of course, only visiting the farm likely once a year. And so, of course, they're only going to have a short window into what the typical production or management on this operation is. But again, we at EarthClaims, we hire auditors that have a great deal of industry experience, have spent a lot of time on operations such as this. And so they're going to be asking a lot of questions about management practices and how often those stalls are kept open, and relying pretty heavily on records too. And so I think this is where we are going to see a need for a lot more robust record keeping because that's how the auditors will typically be evaluating how often an individual sow has been confined, and they're going to be relying pretty heavily on that. But as I mentioned, we have other ways of verifying whether or not it appears that an operation generally has the sows confined more than they ought to in order to be compliant with this regulation. And based on our knowledge of animal behavior and facility setup, I think we could get some insight into non-compliant practices on that. You'll probably talk about this a little bit later, Hyatt, too, but it's still unclear whether the records requirements that California has for these sorts of audits will extend to camera footage viewing on the auditor's behalf. And so I would also keep that in mind that, you know, if free access stalls are being used, that any non-compliance with regard to amount of time that the sows are kept in, if it's picked up on camera footage, you know, California may be able to become aware of that as well and issue a non-compliance for that. It's also noted in the standards too that California can, at its discretion, investigate any complaints of non-compliance too, and they can send an inspector in on an unannounced on-site audit visit too. So I would keep that in mind too, just as you're thinking about management practices that, you know, I'm not entirely clear on what the penalties for non-compliance will be, but I think it's safe to say that any non-compliance will be looked at pretty carefully by California.
Yeah, I believe thank you for the perspective. I believe one of the things that was concerning to some people looking at the actual legislation was it was deemed a criminal offense if you were not if the pork that you were serving or distributing was not deemed to be compliant. So I know that was a sticking point from a legal standpoint for some people on the implementation of Prop 12. So that the penalties might be more than just a slap on the wrist in some cases.
Well, that's right. And also the loss of market access to the state of California could be significant for some individuals. So it's worth considering.
Absolutely. Thank you for that perspective on free access stalls. I'm certainly seeing a lot of those being incorporated into farms at different levels of intensity, but they seem to be a popular option in order to still provide those animals with those animal husbandry steps that are pretty important to keep them productive. A second topic that I think is certainly an area that I deal with a lot is hospital sows. We deal with group housing a lot with Gestal because we're providers of an equipment that can feed sows in group housing environments. Mm-hmm. And no matter how good of a job we do in designing the flooring the right way and the environment the right way, pigs are still a group species that have a dominance hierarchy, and they like to exert their dominance over each other. And so inevitably, we often see a small percentage of sows who become lame or injured or out of body condition standards that we need to isolate and medically intervene to keep them alive and doing well. In the exemptions, animals that are undergoing individual treatment are exempt from Prop 12. And I have pictured above here in the middle an example of a hospital pen not far from a larger pen. But I can see this being a gray area because with the exemption being allowed for hospital sows, some producers are interpreting that as allowing them to use a traditional gestation stall, as you can see in the bottom right of the image, for these specific animals that are undergoing individual treatment. And alongside that, what classifies individual treatment is part of that equation, because obviously, if we're actually administering medication or medical treatment to a sow, that I think classifies as individual treatment. But what about animals that are thin, that we're trying to give them access to more feed to rebuild their body condition? That's something that doesn't happen immediately and may take time to take effect. And so how those animals that are considered hospital sows will be stalled, and what percentage of those animals on the farm is going to be deemed acceptable, is one of those gray areas that I often run into, because some producers who are, for example, using hospital gestation crates, the number of which of those crates might be allowed by a certifier is an area that often comes up in conversation. So I hope I've given you sufficient background to comment further on that.
Yes. Well, I think that's a really interesting question, Hyatt. It's another one of those areas, like you said, that's still requiring a little bit more clarity from CDFA in terms of how they would define individual treatment and what an acceptable percentage would be. I cannot imagine that they are going to completely leave that up to discretion by the certifier. However, the approach that we typically take in animal welfare certification, which I would probably apply to this situation as well, is that our auditors are going to be evaluating which sows are in hospital treatment pens and kind of why they're there. So we'd be looking at treatment records, evaluating their intervention plans, getting a sense of how many, like what percentage of sows are in hospital pens and for what reasons, and whether or not that looks like something that's a little bit outside the percentage norm for this kind of a production setup. Typically, our inspectors want to get a sense that there is an intervention that is occurring with these animals that is on the path to return them back to the rest of the population, right? And so they're going to want to see that they're not just being housed in these pens, but that they have a plan for reintroduction, and that they're making progress on that plan. So I think that's the tack that we would generally see taken. But I like the alternative options that you presented here as possibly some just other out-of-the-box ways of thinking about how to do hospital pens if there is concern, which I think is legitimate concern, that we may run into trouble with using gestation stalls or gestation crates as hospital pens. So the image that you've provided there would still allow the sow to be in proximity to her pen mates without being removed entirely from the population, but she also has the 24 square feet or more that's required by California. And so I think that if we are talking about redesigning some of our barn spaces, which is probably going to be happening in a lot of folks' situations, it would probably be worthwhile finding a way to have hospital pens that are still in compliance with the requirements of California Prop 12 if it's taken at its most strict interpretation.
Yeah, that's helpful perspective, and that aligns well with the advice I've been giving to people as a way to be most likely to comply. I find it interesting that you, as a certifier and auditor, would likely focus on those girls that are in these hospital environments that have appeared to have convalesced and would be candidates for reintroducing back into a group environment. I think that's an interesting demographic of the population that could be focused on by an auditor. Mm-hmm. So I'll talk a little bit more about the housing options in this next topic too. An area that I seem to deal with a lot in these barn designs is the fact that we do have biological variation because these are living, breathing creatures. And just to set up an illustration for you to understand where I'm coming from on this, I took an image from an existing gestation barn that's up at the top in this image, where there's currently 2,724 sow spaces, most of which are individual gestation stalls with a few pens in the top right corner. So with that footprint in mind, and knowing that we need to provide 24 square feet, I've got an example of a possible layout in the bottom that would be compliant, according to my interpretation, in a way to still house these animals and move them through the system strategically. And we would be losing around 650 spaces out of the original space that we had before. And so this is the problem that a lot of producers are facing, is they want to maintain access to California pork, and they're not opposed to providing a potentially better animal welfare environment, but the loss of that many animal units certainly has the likelihood of hurting the pocketbook. And so trying to minimize that loss is important. And one way that I've helped producers try to do that is to look at strategies that allow us to get the most square footage out of the barn that we have without having to build additional expensive spaces. So we've already talked about free access stalls or modified breeding stalls to temporarily restrain sows around the time of breeding, or for new gilts or animals that maybe come back into estrus, as we typically see a percentage of animals who fail to conceive at mating. So having at the left of this barn on the top an area where we can breed and maybe get a little bit better animal husbandry, temporary restraint on these animals that are this core demographic is the focus of this small area to the left of this layout. But then from that, I would move those animals in a group that would hopefully be mated around the same time into prior to preg check pens. There's actually a typo on the slide there. These are pre-preg check pens for 5 to 6 weeks. And those would include about 63 sows in this particular farm example, where those are animals that were all bred around the same time. And you can see at the bottom right of this example pen, a possible swinging gate that could be used as an optional hospital pen to isolate a certain number of sows at Prop 12 standards, but use the space that was already allocated to those animals. Now, for the part of my question that I'm really interested in your perspective, Rachel, is the last stage, the post-preg check pens, which would be after around 35 days of pregnancy examination. This would be an area where we would typically have the opportunity to remove sows that did not maintain their pregnancy after breeding. And many farms would run 85 to 95% conception rate, depending on other factors, but it's not 100%. And so by leaving only the animals that were originally placed in those pens, we would end up understocking those pens further and actually be giving those sows 25, 26, 27 square feet, which is already that much more painful from an economic standpoint to lose that square footage. So when it comes to the strategy for implementing Prop 12 and still maintaining productivity on the farm, these regrouping events, we want to minimize how much of them we need to do, but potentially doing so based on conception rate is one way to still get the most out of the layout. For a certifier, though, the part that I struggle with is if I go back to those designs, I'm moving 63 sows to a pen that was sized for 56 based on that 90-ish% conception rate. On average, that might work out and be pretty close to what a farm typically performs at for conception. But we all know that these are animals, and we're going to have groups where 85% stay pregnant, or groups where 95 or maybe even 98% stay pregnant. And that's where I run into the challenge of how it's going to be interpreted by a certifier when you have a group that is already living together and have gotten along and established their dominance hierarchy, but technically they may exceed that 24 square feet allowance because they had a higher fertility rate. So maybe you could comment if I've laid that out relatively well for you to understand the situation that many producers find themselves on these regrouping events.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it sounds like a really common situation that would occur. So here's how I think about this, Hyatt, is stocking density is a tricky situation for standard setters. And again, EarthClaims not the standard setter here. And it's challenging to write standards around stocking density, because what we know here is that we are not raising widgets, right? We're raising animals, live animals, with variations in terms of their conception rates and many other factors, including size and you name it. So if I were a standard setter, I would probably lean towards finding a way to add in a allowable percentage variation into that stocking density, right? So into that square footage that is permitted per animal, so that we can have a little bit of wiggle room if some of those animals need to leave the group or more needed to be added in. The last thing we want to do is negatively impact producers who are trying to impact animal welfare in a really positive way, right? So who have production practices that are positively impacting their animals' lifestyle. And one of those things is making sure that we're not reintroducing sows to a group or taking sows out of a group that they're accustomed to being in with unnecessarily, right? And creating more aggression situations, right? So if we can allow for a little bit of that, like, percentage variation, that would be fantastic. Now, the way that it's written currently in the rule as it's been given to us, it's a strict 24 square feet with no allowance for averaging or for any percentage variation. Now, I think it would be really great to hear more from CDFA on if they will allow a little bit of that wiggle room. But from my reading of the standard, I don't think that that's currently the way it's going to be asked to be implemented. I think it's going to be a real straightforward 24 square feet per animal, and I'm not sure that we can, as a certifier without additional guidance from CDFA, make any judgment on averaging out that population. So.
Well, and I'm inclined to agree with you from my reading of the legislation as well, and I think that's a little bit unfortunate, as you've alluded, but it's important for us as people trying to become compliant to understand that gray area and interpret it effectively. But it maybe alludes back to how we can use those within pen hospital pens as a way to maybe get the best of both worlds. If you can use it as an open housing area for a pen, but then if you need to seclude a couple sows that would be better being isolated, you can use some of the same footprint you already have allocated to those animals. But certainly these producers are not necessarily in agreement with the 24 square foot decision that was made by the state of California. So having to actually stock animals at 25 or 26 square feet to achieve that is another pinprick in the situation as well. But to keep things moving, I know we have a limited amount of time here. I also, you alluded to this earlier about cameras on farm, and in the past decade of my opportunity to work on a lot of sow farms, I've seen the advent of the use of sow farm cameras being used to make sure that we can capture animal abuse events or view them and hold those responsible quickly and react appropriately. So I wouldn't say this is 100% of farms today, but I would say it's fairly commonplace on many farms to have some camera technologies. And you talked a little bit earlier about when an auditor comes on site. I'm very curious whether these cameras are likely to be considered applicable to auditors that are looking to maybe have a better judgment of what happens on the other 364 days of the year.
Right. Well, that's a very interesting question. And I honestly commend anybody who is implementing these cameras, because I think that's the best way to reduce and mitigate risk from animal abuse allegations. We're seeing that become much more common, that farms of all species, producers of all species, are finding it necessary to have cameras, whether or not they think it's actually going to occur on their operation. Unfortunately, allegations can be made, and it's nice to be able to refer back to that camera footage and definitively know that it was not on your operation, or worst case scenario, it did occur. So I think that's a huge risk mitigation factor. Highly recommend it, becoming much, much more common. Whether or not in this particular program it's going to be required that compliant operations or certified operations release camera footage to certifiers, big question mark around that. I don't know. I know that the way that the standards are currently written is that the producers will need to provide documentation and written records, as well as anybody else being certified throughout the supply chain, right? So they're going to need to be able to provide written records that will indicate how often that sow, each individual sow, has been confined, and whether or not there was any exceptions to that. And they're going to need to be able to show that, paper trail all the way down, or audit trail all the way down the chain of the supply chain for traceability purposes. So the the rule as it's currently written doesn't call out video or photo footage as something that auditors can capture, but I would not be shocked or surprised to know that that is something that does, if not now, get implemented as a requirement or an allowable factor, but eventually may. So yeah, really interesting question and pertinent to the world we're living in, I think.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe a little clearer question here, but I know the term usable space is a term that's gotten scrutinized some in the application of layouts that I've been drawing. I wanted to highlight a couple of areas where you may have to make a call as an auditor about whether this can be counted in the usable space allocation or not. And this example first is a barn that's attempting to be compliant for California standards, and there's a front walkway that just happened to be included in the pen because of where the feed line was forced to sit, but it's clearly preventing sows from being able to access that area. What would be the interpretation of something like that on an on-site visit?
Right, so the rule requires 24 square feet of usable floor space per sow. So just based on this picture that you're showing me here, I would not consider that portion of space behind that pen to be usable by a sow. And so I don't think that would be added into the calculation.
Understood. Well, I agree on that one. And it's certainly important that I follow those guidelines as I work on some of these building designs and make sure the square footage works out. But here's a different example of a fully slatted barn where we have a feeding trough that is one for every sow. So there ends up being, a larger portion of the footprint having these stainless steel feeding troughs. Because this is an area that sows are routinely eating out of and spending time in, would this likely be an area that is considered usable space?
So again, not an accredited certifier with California, but based on how I read the rule, I'm thinking that this is usable floor space because the way that they have currently written it is that is merely left at usable floor space, right? So she's using it. It doesn't specify that she must be able to use this space to lie down in or turn fully recumbent without touching any side of the structure whatsoever. So based on this photo, I would suggest that this would be considered usable floor space, and you could count that into the square footage requirement.
Good. Well, that aligns with what we have been interpreting in many cases those to be. And we talked earlier about a free access stall. This is just one example of a free access stall design, but that front of the free access stall area, I guess, would also be classified as a feeding area that is being used, although she may not be able to necessarily lay her head underneath that area. So I would assume it would probably fall under the same situation as the previous picture.
Yeah, I think that's right, especially if it's left open, right? So she's got access to the rest of the available square footage.
Thank you. Yeah, good to have a few specific examples that aren't quite so ethereal. The last topic, and maybe one of the more gray of all, is what is a breeding pig? Again, it seems simple that, the standards writers are just trying to define the class of animals that are going to be falling under these requirements. But in the terms of many production systems today, the phrase kept for the purpose of commercial breeding has been interpreted a little bit differently by producers because gilts are going to be produced by a farm regardless of whether some of those are kept for breeding or not. So specifically, those that are 180 days of age or older must be housed at 24 square feet or greater. This just so happens to be relatively close to the time when most of these animals are becoming pubertal and getting to be the age when they would be mated if they decide to be kept for commercial breeding. So some farms have gilt pens or GDU, gilt development facilities on site that an auditor could look at while they're present and could possibly validate those animals that are above 180 days are being housed at 24 square feet. But I'd also like to indicate there are a lot of farms that perhaps grow their gilts at offsite locations that might be next door, or they might be hours away, where those gilts are developed until they reach that age where they would be candidates for breeding. So any thoughts on how that might be interpreted and how those offsite gilt development locations would be determined by a certification authority on whether they also need to be audited or not?
Yeah, so that's a tricky one. So certainly we know that not all of the sows or the gilts at this GDU are going to be intended for the commercial breeding purposes for product that's going to the state of California. So given that sort of situation, it's highly likely that we'll see a lot of split operations, which is defined in the standard as an operation that's got two different production styles. So they've got one that is geared towards maintaining compliance with California Prop 12, and then they've got another split segment of that population that is intended not to be compliant with California Prop 12 and perhaps has a different management style. And so the way that they are going to require that to be segregated is physical segregation, and then also a segregation plan and protocol in place, and probably independent or individual sow identification so that they can keep those animals assured of being separate. I would almost guarantee you that they're going to require certification of at least a portion of this operation for the animals that are intended for California Prop 12 commercial breeding, especially once they are bred. So as soon as you insert the AI rod, that I'm guessing that's going to be considered they are now on the path for commercial breeding. And if they're going to a California Prop 12 unit, then they need to be certified. If, of course, we know that some of those sows or some of those gilts are not going to be sent off for the purposes of commercial breeding. And here, of course, you run into the situation that plagues standard setters and certifiers too, right? Where they try to make a really concise definition for something, as you see here, like sows 6 months of age or older, pregnant and being kept for the purpose of commercial breeding. Of course, then everybody comes back and says, well, what about this scenario? What about this scenario? And what do we actually mean by commercial breeding? So then the standard setter has to go back and actually define every single line in that standard. So it makes it a little challenging for all of us to know how to interpret that. But I'm leaning towards the idea that as soon as those sows are bred and we know they're headed towards a California Prop 12 sow unit, even if they don't remain bred, I think that they're going to have to be kept at 24 square feet and be certified as such.
Well, I appreciate you attempting to respond to that. I know it's a little tricky, and it will be helpful, hopefully, if California provides some additional clarification for all of us as things get closer to taking effect. With that, I know we're running short of time, and so I want to wrap things up for this part of our session to talk about what happens after January 1st of 2022, and this is all supposed to really go down. So for producers or allied industry members who are interested in learning how to apply for certification, any comments on how that process will be laid out for farms?
Yeah, so there is within the rule itself some guidance on applying for certification. And of course, at this stage, to my knowledge, again, there are no accredited certifiers. So I am not certain of the process which one would go through in order to apply for certification. However, you can reach out to EarthClaims and we can provide you some guidance as we learn more. And what I understand the process will be is that an individual or a producer group would apply for certification for their operations to the state of California or to the accredited certifier themselves, and then they would select an audit date and have that on-site audit take place. I would presume that some of that possibly could be done not just on site, but via email or video conferencing as well. It looks like that's going to be allowed to some degree. So I think for the purposes of evaluating whether or not an operation is likely to be compliant, likely to achieve certification, that's certainly something that we could advise on even prior to accreditation becoming, solidified. So as far as timeline for adoption, so you're right, it's coming up really quickly, January 1st, 2022. The rule states that operations are required to be compliant with this rule. January 2023, they're supposed to be certified. So there's a window of time there in which if I'm a pork producer, I'm thinking if I'm selling to the state of California, I need to be quite assured that my product is compliant, and if not certified, that it's going to be certified within a very short period of time, especially before January 1st, 2023, because we don't know at this stage what else California is going to add and what other requirements they're going to put in as far as adoption. So I would say if you think that you're going to need to be selling into the state of California, now's the time to get moving on becoming compliant. The last thing we want to do is wait until the 11th hour and find out that there's going to be some challenges to the supply.
Yeah, thanks. And good to know that there is a grace period to get compliant, or to get the actual certification step once you're compliant. So it'll be very interesting how the year 2022 works out in terms of enforcing and rolling through that.
And I don't know, Hyatt, if I would call it a grace period officially, because that's not what California is calling it. But
good point, yeah.
It's an interesting thing to note, I think, that they've made a distinction between the two dates, one for compliance and one for certification, like factual certification. But there is still that requirement for compliance. And what that means is maybe left up to it may be left up to interpretation, but I wouldn't want to spend too much time being out of compliance, I think, if my end goal was to be in compliance, because we just don't know how soon they're going to require that certification, and it may be sooner than the stated date.
Well, on that same subject, I know there's been a lot of questions about, should the sow farm be Prop 12 compliant on December 31st of this year? I've gotten a lot of questions about when the pigs that originated from those sows become compliant. So, for example, there are obviously pigs that are, as of January 1st, they were born of sows that are now Prop 12 compliant that may not necessarily have been Prop 12 compliant when those animals were born. And essentially, when did those pigs that were originating from those farms become compliant themselves? Any comments on that?
Yes, I think that's one of the big areas in which certifiers are going to require additional clarity from CDFA on. What I would say unofficially is that it seems pretty clear that if we don't backdate that certification, from the date that the on-site audit took place, but to the, back to the offspring that were born to that sow that are now in the finisher operation, ready for processing. If we don't backdate it, if they don't allow that to be backdated and quote grandfather in those pigs, state of California is going to have a massive shortfall of pork supply for a period of time until we can get some certified pigs into the food chain. So I can't definitively answer that, as you know, but that would be my take on it.
Well, I'm sure that the demand for pork provisions there. The demand for pork will certainly lubricate that process, I think, somewhat. So I want to end on, you guys have a lot of experience with determining compliance for other standards. When we have a non-compliance event or a farm that fails their audit, what does that look like in other standard situations, or what should producers who might undergo that situation expect from a certifier like yourselves?
Yeah, so that rule is actually pretty clearly laid out in the rule, and so that's one thing that's helpful. So what they have said is, if there is a non-compliance identified at the time of the audit, the operation will receive a notice of non-compliance, and they'll have a time or a date certain by which they must respond with corrective actions or a rebuttal if they feel like the non-compliance was issued in error. So corrective actions to anything that is able to be corrected would be required. And then ideally, or usually, depending on the non-compliance itself, proof of rectification of that non-compliant issue. So, photographs or some sort of documented proof that the change has been made.
Okay.
Yeah, so I'll leave it there, but I think there's generally a process for being able to rectify non-compliance if that's something the operation wishes to do. Otherwise, if they're unable to, then we'd be looking at denial of certification in most cases.
Perfect. Thank you for that, and that seems understandable to me from my vantage point. So with that, I know we've used up our time allocation, and I'd like to thank you, Rachel, for letting me walk you through some of those gray areas that I typically come across. And hopefully for our audience, it's given some additional perspective of what we're facing in the U.S. and particularly for complying with California Prop 12 and its additional animal welfare standards. I'd like to thank you all for joining us today. Those of you that can stay on, please stay on so that we can have some reaction from allied industry professionals and pork producers next, and a panel discussion talking about the reactions that EarthClaims had to these questions about Proposition 12. So look forward to that follow-up discussion. And again, Rachel, thank you for joining us and for your perspective today.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Well, hello, everyone. This is Hyatt Frobose talking, and hope you guys can hear me as we transition to the panel discussion portion of this presentation. Really nice to have that perspective from Rachel in our interview that was pre-recorded. But we also have some specialists who are here with us today to provide a live reaction to their thoughts on the presentation today. And we're going to field some of the Q&A from the audience that we had live during the presentation as well, because there were some great questions for everybody. We really appreciate everyone joining us and participating in this event. Certainly a topic that's interesting and controversial for many of us in the US. But first, before maybe fielding some of those questions, I'd like to introduce each of our panelists that we have here today. I'll start with Dave Wade, who is the Vice President of Operations for the Honor Company. Dave, if you could give us a quick background on yourself and some perspective of why you're a good person for this panel, I'd appreciate it.
Thank you, Hyatt. I was born and raised on a small family farm in west central Minnesota. My father raised pigs and got into the business in the late 70s on total confinement, and have been with 3 companies as a pork producer over those 40 plus years. God, that's hard to believe. Anyway. We also, Honor also is part owner in the Triumph Food Systems, and we also have a GAP compliant farm that we're using for a company we call Peterson Pork. So I think my background in intensive pork production plus the GAP certification brings a little bit of enlightenment here.
Thanks, Dave. I look forward to your input on some of these questions. Our next panelist is Rick Thomas, who is the president of Ag Property Solutions, which is a building contractor company here in the United States. And Rick has been involved in several of the building designs that I've worked with as well. And so, Rick, if you could give a little background for yourself.
Thank you, Hyatt. I appreciate the opportunity. I've been doing design of animal facilities since 1985 and seen a lot of changes come and go in the industry. And as we move into this one, it certainly creates some of our producers' challenges and different interpretations of things. With that background of doing that for that many years, it's allowed us to see many different pieces from the structural side to the equipment side and how that works together.
Thank you, Rick. We'll definitely have some good questions for you. I know you get into crosshairs on a lot of this from what we put into these barns or how we remodel them. Our final panelist is one coming from across the pond, Dr. Dirk Hesse. He's coming to us from Germany, and he is an independent advisor who specializes in pig husbandry. and has a very long resume working with the German industry and the European industry, who have been faced with many of these changing animal welfare requirements from consumers and legislation for quite a bit longer than we have here in the US. So his international perspective is certainly valued. Dirk, if you could give us a little more understanding of what role you've played in your industry, and also I know you have some good points for us on how the European industry has been forced to adapt to some changing requirements over time.
Thank you very much, Hyatt. I apologize, my English is not so very good, but I will try to do my very best. Okay, I was also born some years ago on a pig farm. I studied agriculture, but the pig farm was too small to live from it. So I'm going into scientific, especially animal welfare, animal behavior. So in 1990, it was my promotion work. I developed a free farrowing pen. In this year, 2021, we became this pen into regulations in Germany 30 years ago. We can think about it. Now, in the year 2008, I like to be a freelancer as an independent advisor, my English. Mostly working in Germany, but also some states in the European Union, in the eastern part of Europe. Also, I need 7 days in China, something like that. One time in my life, I was in the US. Only one, I apologize. Yeah, in the year 2080, there is a society in Germany. There are let me say, the good companies in animal husbandry, the whole official advisory from Germany and scientific including, and I'm the CEO on this, on the maybe half of my time. And because of the very, very, very complicated situation, especially for pig farmers in Germany, some farmers get together in the last year and asked me if I want to be their speaker. We have nearly 200 pig farmers over the whole Germany, from small pigs from, let me say, 50 sows per farm. The greatest has 9,000 sows on the farm. And we tried to give solutions for the politicians so that we have a chance to have animal husbandry also in the future. But in Germany especially, we have big problems called Animal Rights Watch. That means people, they want that every animal, human being also animal, and every animal has the same right. And they are very good in profession. And therefore they are able to get high pressure on our politicians, so that we actually, in the new regulations, there are some regulations that are going against the animal, and therefore against the animal farmers. That is, they plan that, because this is the reason, therefore, that especially in Germany, a lot of pig farmers closed their farm. And so we have a lot of work with politicians. That's today the most time I take in business, to speak and discuss with politicians to give a good direction for the pig farming in Germany in the future.
Thanks very much, Dirk. Can you, I know you had a little bit of information to provide some perspective for the audience on the timeline for changes in Germany and elsewhere. I know, at least I see some of the headlines about the End the Crate movement in Europe, but you could probably comment a little bit further, I'm sure, in brief.
I try to do it in brief. So I hope you can see the table. I think we not go into detail. If I understand right, these are the regulations for California. Here you find the actual regulations in Europe. But you keep in mind, we have a EU regulation. Every state in the EU has to put this regulation into their own regulation. And in this step, they can be harder in the regulations. Then for Germany, these are the main data, because also in Germany, we have a little bit problems with regulations and our politicals. So there are some maybe difficult data you find. I try to put our square meters in US square meters so that you have an idea over the places. And because of group housing and farrowing pens, these are the most important things or regulations. You can see in this year on the 9th of February, this come into force. And as you can see, regulations for group housing has to be in practice in the year 2026 and around farrowing grades 2035. So maybe you have an overview, and if you have questions, I can go into detail.
Well, thank you, Dirk. I think that hopefully provides a little perspective for where Germany is heading. I know some of the stats in US metrics like 50 some square foot per sow after weaning is certainly a number that would raise some eyebrows for some people. And it looks like you're heading towards 70 square feet and farrowing, which would certainly make some changes for us in the US if we have that at some point too. So I appreciate that perspective, Dirk, and circling back to some of the comments and questions we had during the session here. I'm sure we won't be able to touch on all of them, but some great questions from our audience. I'd like to start with one that I think maybe first directed towards Dave Wade. With you having some perspective with these animal welfare standards programs in the US with your GAP farm today, Dave, what areas did you feel were left out from the discussion? I tried to highlight some questions that I regularly come across with regard to building design, but were there any areas that you feel like weren't brought up between Rachel and myself with regard to California compliance on farm?
At this point, no. The 24 square feet is pretty self-explanatory. You got to have that amount of square feet per sow, and there's really not many rules to break. When we went through we've gone through 3 or 4 or 5 audits now on our GAP sow farm, and the regulations for them is quite a bit more stringent than the California rules today. What I still struggle with is the individual body condition and how you handle that. And your feeding system, or the Gestal feeding system, allows us to individually monitor each of those sows through a microchip or the RFID tag that regulates the amount of feed to each animal. So the next step then is for lame animals, is probably the biggest one that we have to address, is how do we manage the lame animals and isolate them properly and to make sure that they get proper treatment.
Yeah, thank you on that, Dave. Rick, do you have any comments? I know you've been actively participating in a lot of building designs. Is there any specific areas that you felt weren't touched on that should have been with regard to farms trying to come into compliance?
I think the one that I've gotten quite a bit of feedback on is the average 24 square foot and what is considered usable. In other words, is a walkway 3 foot in the front of the crate area or something like that considered usable? The picture you had was obvious it's not usable, but when we get to that 3 or 4 foot area, that if an animal lays down and others can't get through there to get to another common area, is that considered usable or not? So I think that is one area that I still see as gray in some of the designs that producers are asking us to put together.
Yeah. If I could add a comment, when they talk about free access stalls, they're talking about temporary restraint. And I would like to change the terminology of that to voluntary restraint. that sow actually determines whether she's going to go in that crate or not.
Yeah, Dave, that's a great point. And we did have a couple of questions in the Q&A that were related to that. It probably was that I didn't define my question really well in the session with Rachel. I would say that the area that I see the most gray area on is most free access stalls or modified breeding stalls have the ability to lock them shut for short periods of time, like AIing or preg checking or treating. And I think that's going to be actively done on a lot of these farms that are using those for those purposes. The question that the certifiers or auditors are going to be faced with is how long are they restrained and how much time accumulates for that animal, because the legislation requires not more than 24 hours in a 30-day period. So yes, during the voluntary use of free access stalls, I don't think that's going to be scrutinized too much at all. But when those are locked shut, auditors are going to ask for records to show when an animal was restrained. And I think that's going to be a challenge for a lot of producers to be able to keep those records, because that isn't something that's being regularly kept today, but it could end up being an area of concern for auditors who are trying to make sure that is staying in compliance, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a really interesting area for both the people on site and the auditors to try to find a happy medium there where it can work. And Rachel is with us on the Q&A today, so she may add comments in the Q&A session if she feels appropriate. Yeah, go ahead, Dirk.
Maybe I can give an example from the German regulations. I think in the future, very common will be the single grade with free access, because we have to have a group housing after weaning, and then we need places where sows get into, because other sows are very aggressive, let me say that. And in the regulations, we have also defined that the sow in a group housing needs a lying area of 1.3 square meter, means 13.99 square feet. So, and if you have a group housing with this 1.3 square meter lying area, then you are allowed to put on that lying area a feeding grade, single grade free access. And if in this grade you have a free place about 1.3 square meter, then you are allowed to put this area 1, 2, 3, including the 5 square meters you need after weaning. And
okay. So
I think that will be the common system for the future, because you need some space for the sows to be.
Dirk, can you comment on audits or certification that exists in Germany for the times when those animals are temporarily restricted in the feeding crate? Any perspective on how that's been done?
Yeah. First of all, we have, a company for working, to have a good working place. And from this company, it's an official company, there's a rule that if you want to work with a sow, you have to put it into a grate. So we have that as regulation for working safe. And in the regulation for the animal welfare, there is no definition of numbers of hours or something. Only is defined that you can fix the sow into the grate through the working time for insemination, for the working time, not more.
Understood. Yeah, thank you for that perspective, Dirk. A question for Rick especially, but I'd like comments from all on this. You've been working with some producers who are moving towards Prop 12 compliance, Rick. We talked a little bit about hospital pens, hospital stalls. What are you finding are the common choices being made there, and especially with regard to the percentage of space? relative to the full breeding herd that's allocated for those hospital spaces? What are you seeing as a range or popular choices for that strategy?
I think it's migrated in the last few months to where we're seeing in the pen some Gestal type penning for the hospitalization. And depending on the size of pen, but we're seeing from 2 to maybe up to 5 animal spaces there. I think the question that was raised earlier about what that's qualified as, is that a sow that's maybe not in the condition we prefer her to be in, can it be used for that? But that's what we're seeing done to try to mitigate moving animals in and out of a pen, trying to keep somewhat of a constant group without having to have another place to go to.
Yeah, the within pen hospital space.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty space efficient way to do it. And I found Rachel's comments pretty interesting about how an auditor is going to evaluate those girls that are hospitalized at the time of the audit, because inevitably I would expect you'd find some convalesced animals that have recovered, that from a dominance hierarchy standpoint, I may not want to move them back in with their old group, but at the same token, an auditor might look at them and say, hey, these animals do not need to be receiving individual treatment. So I think that's an area what's going to be interesting if they're not being housed at 24 square foot, how an auditor might interpret some of those animals that have convalesced or recovered. Dave or Dirk, any comments on that?
Generally speaking, in our pen gestation facilities, we usually run 5 to 7%, 8% hospital pens or crates in our typical gestation barns. So I'm assuming that that ratio is probably not going to change much, that you're going to need somewhere between 5 and 8%.
One of the questions, oh, go ahead, Dirk.
For Germany, we have 2 points in regulation for hospitality pens. First of all, the floor has to be soft. The floor has to be soft. The most possible is to have straw into it, but that's a very good problem in hygiene. So normally we take rubber mats. And the second one is the animal has to be able to turn around easily. No square meter, nothing like that, to turn around easily. And now when, let me say, into the controls, it goes in that direction that you have 1 to 3% hospitality grades to the number of the animals you have on the farm.
Okay.
That's no regulation.
Understood. Thank you for that perspective for the European side of things. One of the questions we had in the many good questions today during the session was about the use of dynamic pens. You know, in group housing, we often talk about static groups versus dynamic groups. Would any of you guys on the panel like to discuss the benefits or challenges with dynamic grouping strategies? I, for example, could say that dynamic pens would be more space efficient as far as keeping sows at the minimum requirement of space. Dave or Dirk or Rick, any comments about how those are being used differently or the popularity of one option versus another?
We have a lot of,
go ahead, Dirk, please.
We have a lot of experiences into praxis. Let me say in a very rough way, in dynamic groups, you need less space per pig, and you have also less investigations for the piggery. In single grades with free access, you have the highest investigation and you need most of the place. But in economics, a very important data is the farrowing rate, because sows which are going outside the group in the time before farrowing are very expensive sows. And so we also see that in a single grade with free access, we have a farrowing rate normally from over 90%, and in the dynamic group under 80. And there's a lot of money you can lost.
Yeah,
So
that's a
I
big
think
difference.
Single grade with free access is, if you look at and on economical way, it's the best solution.
Thank you for that perspective. Dave, you had comments as well?
Yeah. Pretty much everything we have is static groups, but the difference is that we can, they're in crates for the first 30 to 45 days after insemination, and then they're put together after the preg check. So that's a huge discrepancy between what California regulations are going to be looking at right now and the way we're presently running our gestation systems. In our gap farm, we still just run static groups. We've got plenty of room to do that with. So we don't do much dynamic. Just from the obvious points of fighting and risk of losing that pregnancy because of fighting.
Thank you, Dave. We've got time to field a couple more questions, and one of the ones that I want to make sure we touch on, and then I think I've got a good one for Dirk to comment on as we wrap things up today. But there were several questions in the Q&A about biosecurity for audits and unannounced audits, and I don't know that any of you guys are perfectly capable of answering that, but I think it's an interesting topic to bring up because Dr. Temple Grandin made a comment in Pig Progress recently about how COVID-19 required a lot of virtual audits and some of the problems associated with that for the integrity of some of these standard systems long term. It definitely appears as though some virtual audits might be allowed by the state of California, but they stress that they want to have face-to-face audits. And so that unannounced audits and biosecurity side of things, I think, is going to be an area of interest for people who are looking to be compliant. Any comments from you guys on that piece of the equation? Dave, how has that been managed for you guys in the audits that you guys have experienced?
We usually get at least a month notice before the auditor shows up. So we go through our health rules with them, they understand them, and they can hit multiple sites on our farm and our gap farm. So going from site to site, as long as you follow the pyramid, we can accommodate that.
If I understand the question right, in Germany, we have regulations in terms of hygiene. They depend on the number of pigs you have. Most of the small and middle farms, let me say like that, let me say under 1,000 sows, something like that, they only need to put on new clothes if they have to go into the stable. And if you are in bigger farms, you have to have a shower before. So we have, I think, very good regulations in terms of hygiene. Great problem in Germany we have, including the African swine fever, because we have, let me say, some people, they want to have that all our pigs have access to the sun and to the wind. On my experience, that's a bad solution for the pigs. It looks nice for the human eyes, but it's bad for the pigs. Our problem is in these areas where we have African swine fever at the wild boars, we did not allow to have pigs outside the building. This is a regulation for the ecological farming. So we have great problems in ecological pig farmings in that area with African swine fever, and the area is great and is being greater every day. We have big problems there.
Well, I think the implementation of these audits for Proposition 12 will certainly be something that certifiers will need to work with producers on to make sure that we can maintain biosecurity for all diseases. And you guys would face that, especially with African swine fever, which we're certainly trying to keep out of the US. But this will be something that I think with good communication between certifiers and producers, I think there's a path forward that will be acceptable there. The last question I have, which is particularly directed towards you, Dirk, I think we all understand that this continues to be a moving target for animal welfare standards in the pork industry. Germany has a perspective of seeing where this is going next. So you can see the regulations that California is putting in place for breeding and gestation. What tips would you have or guidance would you have as to what topics are likely to come next for in terms of legislation or consumer demands that pork producers in the US should be maybe trying to be moving towards if they want to stay ahead of the curve and stay compliant for future legislation?
Oh, I hope I understand your question right.
Yeah.
First of all, I will say our society in Germany don't know that they want a change in agriculture. They don't know. We have some media and we have some, let me say, animal rights people. They bring a big pressure into politics, but most of the people in Germany like to buy cheap pork clothes. So we have big problems also because of the African swine fever, because in Germany, the most of the people in Germany only like to eat the good things from the pig, maybe 20–25%. Not the bad one, and we have to export that because we have to have money for the whole pig. Because of African swine fever, the possibility to export to China, Asia, and something like that is going nearly zero. So we have very, very big problems. And the following, some retailers in Germany began to import pork from Chile because it's cheaper than from Germany. So we have a lot of problems in that. But I think we are working very, very hard on it to discuss with our peoples and to bring over the peoples to the politicians the right way so that we can make, let me say, animal welfare from the animal point of view. If you make it from the animal point of view, at the end, the animal is going better. Because it's better, we have more from the pig. That's the thing we have in practice, and we want to get this point of view into politics, but it's a hard way, but we try to do it.
Well, thank you for that perspective, Dirk. Rick, do you have any comments about what you're seeing producers who are maybe trying to stay ahead of the curve? Are they doing anything in farrowing or in growing pig housing that would be kind of taking the next step to anticipate maybe what's likely to be legislated next?
Yeah, I think there's a number of producers out there that are, as they're looking at the reduction in number of animal spaces in the gestation, then are also looking at how do we redo our farrowing, because otherwise we're gonna have too many crates. But if we're gonna have to increase the size from 48 to 70, somewhere in that range, how does that equate back into the animal flow process? And then they're also looking at the idea that our PSY continues to climb, and how does that relate to the total number of piglets that was in our original contract that we needed to produce? So is there a way that as we look at this, we can be Prop 12 compliant, move towards what we believe is compliance in farrowing, but still get to an animal flow basis that is somewhat balanced with what we were trying to achieve to begin with? So that's probably the most common approach that we're seeing explored.
Yeah, thank you. Dave, any final comments for us? I know we're coming up against our timeline, so your parting words.
One big comment here. We talked about the producer. What we have not talked about is the audit trail that's going to have to take place with the packing plant and the harvest plant.
Yeah.
Because what this is going to do, because you got to segregate the population, you're going to have special slaughter, harvest times. The trucks have to show up. There may be certain days that the harvest plant uses, but the audit trail and the logistics of getting those animals to the harvest plant are going to be it's going to be interesting times for us.
think onerous is a good word for that, Dave.
Yeah.
And I didn't try to open that can of worms too much for time purposes today,
Yeah,
but
right.
I certainly think that's going to be a challenge for everybody from, you know, farm to fork. And the certifiers like EarthClaims and others are going to be right in the mix on that too. And being able to keep track of that and regulate that's going to be a challenge. So a good point to add on there. So with that, everybody, I'd like to thank you all again for participating. We've had a good set of questions and a good number of participants online. Dirk, Rick, Dave, appreciate your perspective and thanks for joining us today. Hopefully this was a great chance for us to kick off the Gestal Swine Summit. I'd like to encourage you all to register for the next few weeks of some other interesting topics. And once again, thank everybody for being here today. It was my pleasure to host this session for the Gestal Swine Summit, sponsored by Hypor.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for hosting the session. Very good. Thank you.